Okay, folks, we're back, coming again live from the laundry room. This is the second part of my series on CSS. The first part we talked a little bit about just about CSS syntax and a couple of conventions around colors and sizes, and just a very small number of CSS properties. There are many, many more, and the MDN kind of learning track is one that I would really recommend you to explore at least a little bit. You won't be able to get through everything. There's some just massive amounts of information there, but it'll be a really good, helpful start. But today we're going to talk mostly about layout and understanding first the basic way that HTML lays pages out and what's called the box model, and then various values of the display property and how they impact the display of the page. And we're especially going to talk about the kind of relatively recent innovations in layout, Flexbox and Grid, which have really made it a lot easier to lay pages out, but which add some complexity. And then we'll very briefly describe media queries. There is a repo associated with this work, the CSS layout repo in the Digital History Organization on GitHub, and I recommend that you check it out and follow along in the developer tools as I suggested in another video. Okay, so the basic organization of elements in HTML is accomplished through what's called a box model. So each block level element is given its own box, like a rectangle, and that rectangle has dimensions, which are calculated eventually in pixels, and those dimensions are comprised of not only the content of the element, but we start on the inside with the content, and then around the content is something called padding. Around the padding is the border, the visible border, and around the border is what's called a margin, so space between the border and other elements that might be present on the page. So you should kind of memorize this image so that you have a sense of what margin, border, and padding mean and how they influence the size of the box. In a real web page, there are lots and lots of elements, and those elements are nested inside each other, sometimes very deeply nested. And we can think of these as a set of Russian dolls, matryoshka, the dolls that fit inside each other. And here we have, a parent container with a bunch of children, and those children are likely to have grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren inside them. So this is a kind of standard, standard page layout, which you see replicated in the class quite a bit. So remember that these elements are Russian dolls, and often the parent has, for most properties, the parents has some influence on what happens inside the children. So for instance, if the parent sets a background color, then that background color propagates down to the children unless the children override it. Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit in the last CSS lecture. The fundamental distinction in CSS is between block level and inline level elements. So block levels get their own boxes, inline elements don't. Inline block elements are less commonly used, though they're still pretty commonly used, and they don't really take up their own row in the page, but they do allow you to set a height and width, which inline elements won't. So sometimes you'll find yourself wanting to give an inline block property to something because you want to be able to set its height and width. In the normal flow of HTML, the browser goes through the tree of elements, what's called the DOM, the Document Object Model, and processes them one at a time. And each block level element gets its own line, and then the elements inside that get their own space, and then we go on to the next sibling of that first block level element, and so forth. So the inline elements are displayed inside the lines in a block level element, and the heights of the line are set by the height of the content. And that's how things would normally go. Layout in CSS is the kind of process of overriding those normal flows. So we instruct elements to either step out of the normal flow or to set new rules for the flow around them or inside them. There are three main layout systems: the display system, the position system, and the float system. We will not today talk about float and position, although we will definitely mention them later on in the class, but we're going to focus today on display and the kind of radical ways in which you can disrupt the flow of a page using especially the new values for display. So there are a bunch of values, but the ones we care about are none, which means do not display this at all, and take it entirely off the page. Don't just hide the content, but eliminate the space that it would ordinarily take. Block, inline block, we've already talked about. And then there are these other two, flex and grid. And so first, let's look at none, and then let's talk about how flex and grid work. Okay, so here's our default view, and we're going to be working here with header. So we can see right now, header's the first thing inside that parent element, and so it appears on top. We're highlighting it with magenta so we can see it. Yes, that's the default. Now, if we instead set the display value to none, then when we look at the page, we'll just see that the rest of the page scoots up because that whole block is just removed from the flow. When we want to talk about flex, notice here that we're doing something different, where we're declaring flex in the parent container, and then we're going to give some instructions for the children. This is a child selector, so it will apply to the direct children of the Flexbox. Those things to recognize about Flex: it is a one-dimensional layout, so it only thinks about flow either this way or that way. You can reverse it, have it go from bottom to top or from right to left. And it is often thought of as a content out system. So the container determines the direction of the flow and a very small number of defaults, but most of the styling is still done in the children. It is very cool, and we see here with the instructions that we gave it, we suddenly have a very different kind of layout where all of the elements line up in a single row and take up some space for the columns that they need. So let's talk a little bit about some concepts in Flex. There's a container, and inside the direct children are what are called the Flex items. The container has display Flex. The items are the direct children. Within the container, we control the direction of the order, so it can be left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top, and also the wrapping behavior. Are the items allowed to wrap onto another row or to another column? And also some default box alignments. Do we find them in the center? Do they spread out? Do they go all to the left? Do they go all to the right? Most other properties are controlled inside the items, and this is different from grid, so it's important to just pay attention here for a moment. Yeah, so in a flex box, there are two axes, as one would expect. The main axis is horizontal if the flex direction is column, and vertical if the flex direction is row. And by default, the flex direction is row. And the cross axis, did I get that right? Anyway, the cross axis is vertical if flex direction is column, and horizontal if flex direction is row. So, you'll forget, I forget, as you hear me speaking right now, which is the main axis and which is the cross axis in the various settings. But you'll just experiment, and as you play with it, you'll get a feel for it. There are two alignment or placement instructions. There's the align items, which gives you the default cross-axis alignment, and the justify content, which gives you the default main axis alignment. So, and then there's align self and order, which we can look at later. So maybe looks like I don't have any examples in here, and I probably should have some. Maybe we can do that in a moment with some demoing, actually. So let's go here to main, check out the rules. Let's set it to flex, which by default will give it a flex direction of row, which means that the box will take up, the container will take up one row, and the items will be aligned in columns. If we change the align items to flex end, we'll see what happens is that they drop to the bottom. If we change it to flex start, they'll pop up to the top. And if we change the flex direction to columns, there they move all over to the left. So you can see that when you when I change the flex direction from column to row, the instructions align and justify change meaning. So why don't we actually justify content. What are the flex start? Yeah. A little bit hard to see what that does here. Yeah, you need a slightly different arrangement of boxes. Okay. Oh, and then order. Let me just do. So do this with the children. So we have nav right now. I can give it order 4 and it drops to the bottom. I can give it order 0 and it pops up to the top. And it's not an absolute placement. Doesn't mean 0 means it's first and 4 means it's last. It'll be relative. So I can give this order -1. Oops. And the sidebar will pop to the top. Anyway, you can play with those later. Okay. can see I often am a little bit fuzzy with Flexbox. I use Grid a lot more. So let's go check out Grid. So Grid has a lot in common with Flexbox, and they were kind of developed simultaneously. But instead of a one-dimensional layout, Grid is a two-dimensional layout. And instead of being content out, it's container in. So most of the Grid properties are usually set in the container element itself. And then, so the Grid is all set up by the container, and then children get to choose their position in the Grid that's already been set up. So here we have a little bit of code for a Grid layout. So we'll, in the main element, the container element, will set the display value to Grid, make sure that it gets to be 100% of its parent, of the space that's available to it, and then we'll use these weird complex properties, Grid template rows, to set the size of the rows. So it'll be a short row at the top, a small row at the bottom, and a bigger row in the middle. These are new units called fraction units. So we have a total of 6 fractions defined here for the rows, 1 at the top, 1 at the bottom, and 4 in the middle. So the one in the middle will be 4 times as big as the ones on the top and bottom. And then we have Grid template columns with 2 columns defined, one third of the width being in the first column and 2/3 of the width being in the second column. That's basically all we have, except for some styling ones to highlight the Grid elements, and then we just have basically the same HTML that we had before, main with a header, a side, an article, and a footer. And if we go next, we'll see, whoa, check it out. It was so easy to create this actually kind of complex layout. And you can think, wow, this is why people use Grid. It's really so easy. Yeah, so there are a lot of ideas coming from Flex. The control that you have is generally finer, and there are 2 dimensions. As in Flex, there is a container, and then the direct children of that container, the ones directly inside, not the grandchildren, not the great-grandchildren, just the children, are called the Grid items, and they're the ones that get placed on the Grid. So in the container, we want to set the pattern for this 2-dimensional Grid that we're going to place items in. The concepts here are templates and areas. So Grid template columns and Grid template rows set up instructions for how many columns and rows to assign in this Grid. And we work with those all the time. But another cool thing that in some ways can kind of supplant the templating of rows and columns is the Grid template areas instruction, which will assign names to the existing areas and then let you put the children just in the named areas. It's the easiest way to place children in a Grid. So we can place items 2 ways. One, by the Grid area method that I just described, you give a child the Grid area property, and then the value of that property will be the name that was set in the parent's Grid template areas property. Or you can place it directly on the Grid using Grid column and Grid row numbers. You can either give the column 1, 2, or 3, or you can span columns. So if there are 3 columns in the Grid, you can make an item span all 3 columns by giving it Grid column 1/3, 4, I think. Learning Grid is, I'm not going to be able, finite lecture time to actually teach you the grid, and in fact you're really going to need to practice as much as possible. So I have links here which you can look at on your copy of this lecture to a visual cheat sheet, and also to the Mozilla Developers Network Grid series, which is incredibly helpful, I find. Okay, so that's layout. I mean, this is like a whirlwind fast rush through layout. We have display block, display none, display flex, and display grid for these different ways of displaying or not displaying elements. And a lot of the hardest stuff in assignment 1 is going to be around layout. So you're going to have to put a lot of work into that, into learning those skills. The final thing I want to just very briefly mention is media queries, which you're going to have to know a little tiny bit about in order to become a kind of web developer. Media queries are really important in today's world, in which we have web pages that are displaying on devices that might be radically different from each other. So great big desktops with huge sort of, iMac screens, or TVs, laptops, tablets, phones, which might have very tiny screens, might be really, really narrow. So in order for these pages to display adequately on all those devices, they have to change when they move from one device to another. And we make those changes with media queries, which allow what are called responsive development. So the web page responds to the environment that it finds itself in, and media queries look like this. They have you find them in a CSS file, and they kind of have the structure of a regular CSS selector. There's like a selector part at the front, and then a stanza. But if we look at the stanza, it's a little weird. Because inside the query we have normal CSS selectors. So some regular query will be here, and there'll be a rule and a value, just like there would in outside of media queries. The thing about media queries is that the CSS that is written inside those queries applies only to devices that match these criteria. So this one will apply on a screen, not in print. Almost all, we're only really thinking about screens here in this class. And it will apply to anything that has a minimum width of 500 pixels. Whereas this one will apply to will instead apply to anything that has a width of less than 500 pixels, 499 or less. So you would maybe write most of your CSS, all the colors and things like that, outside of the queries, and then you would set specific values inside the queries for different devices. And we will do that, I think, just once in the assignment, working with a grid to kind of change the layout as we move to another device. Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, that's it for the lecture. So enjoy your work, explore all the resources that are in the syllabus and in the announcements and so forth, and I look forward to seeing you in class to practice some of these skills with the practice repositories that I have sent out to you in announcements.